The North Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly before Lieutenant Commander William Henderson as he peered through the periscope of HMCS Sackville. It was September 3, 1939, and the declaration of war had just reached the Royal Canadian Navy. What Henderson couldn't know was that he was about to witness the opening moves of history's longest naval campaign, a brutal 6-year struggle that would claim more lives than any other continuous military operation of the Second World War. 3 days earlier, the German submarine U-30 had torpedoed the British passenger liner Athenia without warning, sending 1,400 souls into the icy waters. Among the dead were Canadian civilians, including children returning from European holidays. The attack violated international maritime law and signaled a new kind of warfare, one where merchant ships became legitimate targets and the ocean itself became a battlefield. The German Kriegsmarine, under the command of Admiral Karl Dönitz, had developed a revolutionary strategy called tonnage warfare. Rather than engaging enemy warships directly, German U-boats would systematically destroy merchant vessels carrying vital supplies to Britain. Dönitz calculated that sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them would starve Britain into submission. His Wolfpack tactics, where multiple submarines coordinated attacks on convoys, had already proven devastatingly effective during the Great War. Commander Henderson understood the implications immediately. Canada's small but determined navy would face an enemy that had spent years perfecting underwater warfare. The German submarine fleet possessed advanced technology, including the Type 7 U-boat, capable of diving to depths of 200 meters and remaining submerged for extended periods. These steel sharks could strike without warning and disappear into the ocean's depths before escort vessels could respond. The Royal Canadian Navy had entered the war with only 13 destroyers and 5 minesweepers, a pitifully small force to protect the world's longest coastline. Yet Canada's geographic position made it crucial to the Allied war effort. The Great Circle route from Halifax to Liverpool offered the shortest path for North American supplies to reach Britain. Every ton of wheat, steel, oil, and ammunition that sustained the British war effort had to cross 3,000 miles of submarine-infested waters. As Henderson's corvette joined its first convoy escort duty, he reflected on the enormous responsibility facing his nation. Britain's survival depended on maintaining the Atlantic lifeline, and Canada had become the western anchor of this vital supply chain. The convoys would depart from Halifax, Sydney, and Montreal, carrying everything from Canadian wheat to American tanks and aircraft. The submarine threat had already begun to materialize. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like wolves, using sophisticated tactics developed during the interwar period. They would surface at night to attack convoys, then submerge before dawn to avoid detection. The submarine commanders, many of them veterans of the previous war, understood that victory in the Atlantic would determine the outcome of the entire conflict. Henderson's crew consisted of young Canadian sailors, most of whom had never seen combat. They came from fishing villages in Nova Scotia, prairie farms in Saskatchewan, and industrial cities in Ontario. These men would soon learn that the Battle of the Atlantic demanded not just courage, but endurance beyond human limits. They would face months at sea in cramped conditions, fighting an enemy they could rarely see, and whether that could be more dangerous than enemy action. The stage was set for a campaign that would stretch across 6 years and claim the lives of more than 70,000 sailors, merchant seamen, and naval personnel. Canada's role in this struggle would transform a small Dominion navy into one of the world's most effective anti-submarine forces. By May 1940, the strategic situation in the Atlantic had become desperate. The German conquest of Norway and France had provided the Kriegsmarine with new submarine bases much closer to the vital shipping lanes. From ports like Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, U-boats could now reach the mid-Atlantic convoy routes with unprecedented ease, spending weeks hunting Allied merchant vessels instead of precious days in transit. Captain James Prentice stood on the bridge of HMC's Assiniboine, watching the latest convoy form up in Halifax Harbor. The sight before him represented both hope and desperation. 67 merchant ships, loaded with Canadian grain, American steel, and British gold, all destined for a United Kingdom that teetered on the edge of starvation. Winston Churchill had privately admitted that the U-boat threat represented the only thing that truly frightened him about the war's outcome. The German submarine offensive had entered what their commanders called the first happy time, operating with near impunity along the North American coast. U-boats were sinking merchant vessels faster than the Allies could replace them. In April alone, German submarines had destroyed over 700,000 tons of shipping, while Allied shipyards had managed to complete only 200,000 tons of new vessels. The mathematics of attrition warfare clearly favored the submarines. Admiral Dönitz had expanded his Wolfpack tactics with devastating effectiveness. Groups of 8 to 12 U-boats would spread across the convoy routes, maintaining radio contact to coordinate massive attacks. When a convoy was spotted, the submarines would shadow it for hours, calling in reinforcements before launching simultaneous assaults from multiple directions. The limited number of escort vessels, often just 2 or 3 warships, protecting 60 merchant ships, made effective defense nearly impossible, according to contemporary reports from the Naval Historical Center. Canada's corvette program had become the cornerstone of the Allied response. These small, versatile warships could be built quickly in Canadian shipyards and were specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. The Flower-class corvettes, based on a whale-catcher design, proved remarkably seaworthy despite their small size. They could maintain station in the worst Atlantic storms and carried the latest detection equipment available. Captain Prentice's ship mounted a 4-inch naval gun, depth-charge throwers, and the newly developed ASDIC sonar system. This underwater detection equipment could locate submerged submarines at ranges up to 1,500 yards, though its effectiveness was severely limited by weather conditions and the thermal layers that characterized Atlantic waters. The technology required skilled operators and considerable experience to distinguish between submarine contacts and false echoes from schools of fish or underwater terrain. The human cost of the submarine war had become staggering. Merchant seamen faced a mortality rate higher than any other branch of the Allied forces. When a torpedo struck an oil tanker, the resulting explosion and fire often left no survivors. Ships carrying ammunition might disappear entirely in a single, devastating blast. Even those lucky enough to reach lifeboats faced the prospect of death from exposure in the North Atlantic's frigid waters. Canadian shipyards had responded to the crisis with unprecedented productivity. The Park Steamship Company, a Crown corporation established specifically for wartime construction, had begun launching Liberty ships and their Canadian equivalent, the Park ships, at an extraordinary rate. These vessels were built using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques that reduced construction time from months to weeks. The industrial cities of Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver had become floating arsenals, producing not just ships but the escorts to protect them. The technological war beneath the waves had also intensified. German submarine designers had developed new periscope systems that were nearly impossible to detect, while improved torpedo designs made U-boat attacks more deadly than ever. The standard German torpedo could sink a large merchant vessel with a single hit, and the newest models featured magnetic detonators that would explode beneath a ship's hull, breaking its back and causing rapid sinking. As Captain Prentice watched the convoy begin its eastward journey, he knew that the next few weeks would test every aspect of Canadian naval training and equipment. The merchant ships under his protection carried not just supplies, but the hopes of a nation that had committed everything to the Allied cause. The Battle of the Atlantic had become a race against time, and Canada's small but determined navy stood at the center of humanity's struggle for survival. The convoy, designated HWEC-72, had been at sea for 4 days when the first U-boat contact appeared on the aft screen of HMCS Sackville. Lieutenant Commander Henderson felt his stomach tighten as the distinctive ping echoed through the corvette's bridge. It was October 19, 1940, and the German submarine offensive had reached its most dangerous phase. The convoy consisted of 41 merchant ships carrying desperately needed supplies to Britain. Among them were tankers loaded with aviation fuel, freighters packed with Canadian wheat, and cargo vessels carrying American aircraft engines. The loss of any single ship would represent a significant blow to the Allied war effort. But Henderson knew that U-boats typically attacked in coordinated groups. The sonar contact might be just the beginning of a much larger assault. Contact bearing 270, range 1,200 yards, reported the ASDIC operator, his voice steady despite the tension. Henderson ordered an immediate course change, steering directly toward the submarine's estimated position. The corvette's 4-inch gun crew scrambled to action stations while depth-charge teams prepared their underwater weapons. The race between hunter and hunted had begun. The German submarine, U-101, had been stalking the convoy for 6 hours, carefully positioning itself ahead of the merchant ship's projected course. Captain Lieutenant Fritz Muller had already radioed the convoy's position to other submarines in his wolf pack, and he knew that at least 3 additional U-boats were converging on the target. The attack would begin at sunset, when the submarines could use darkness to mask their approach. Henderson's tactical situation reflected the broader strategic challenges facing the Royal Canadian Navy. His single corvette was responsible for protecting the convoy's port flank, covering an area of ocean nearly 20 miles wide. 2 other escorts, HMCS Chambly and HMS Gladiolus, guarded the starboard side and forward positions respectively, against a coordinated submarine attack. These 3 small warships would be severely outnumbered. The first torpedo struck the merchant vessel Empire Minerva at 2100 hours. The explosion lit up the northern horizon like a false dawn, and within minutes the 10,000-ton cargo ship had broken in half and disappeared beneath the waves. Henderson watched in horror as lifeboats scattered across the dark water, their occupants calling for help that might never come. The convoy's commodore immediately ordered an emergency turn to starboard, but the defensive maneuver had been anticipated by the German submarine commanders. U-boat warfare had evolved into a sophisticated science by 1940. The submarines would typically attack from different directions simultaneously, forcing the escorts to choose between protecting the convoy and pursuing individual submarines. The German commanders had studied Allied escort tactics extensively, identifying weaknesses in the defensive formations that could be exploited by coordinated attacks. That is reported in the official Royal Canadian Navy War Diary. The battle for Convoy, HX-72, lasted for 7 hours and resulted in the loss of 9 merchant vessels totaling nearly 60,000 tons of shipping. The German submarines had achieved their tactical objectives with minimal risk, demonstrating the effectiveness of Wolfpack tactics against inadequately protected convoys. Henderson's corvette managed to damage one submarine with a depth charge attack, but the underwater explosion only forced the U-boat to dive deeper rather than destroying it. The primitive sonar equipment available in 1940 made it nearly impossible to track a submarine that had gone deep, and the German commanders had learned to exploit this technological limitation. They would dive to maximum depth after attacking, then surface hours later in a completely different location. The human cost of the attack became apparent as dawn broke over the convoy. Rescue operations continued for hours, with merchant seamen pulled from the icy Atlantic water suffering from hypothermia and oil burns. Many of the survivors had spent the night in lifeboats, watching their shipmates disappear beneath the waves. The psychological impact of such losses would haunt the merchant marine throughout the war. The tactical lessons from HX-72 would influence Canadian naval strategy for months to come. The attack had demonstrated that existing escort forces were insufficient to protect the vital convoy routes. More ships, better technology, and improved training would be necessary to counter the growing submarine threat. The Royal Canadian Navy had learned that the Battle of the Atlantic would require not just courage, but a complete transformation of naval warfare doctrine. As Henderson's corvette limped back to Halifax for repairs and resupply, he reflected on the enormous challenge facing his nation. The submarines had proven that they could strike with impunity, sinking vital supplies while avoiding significant losses. Canada's role in the Atlantic battle would need to expand dramatically if the Allies were to maintain their lifeline to Britain. The winter of 1941 brought unprecedented challenges to the Battle of the Atlantic as German U-boat operations reached their peak efficiency. Captain Leonard Murray, now appointed as the first Canadian to command a major Allied naval theatre, stood in the operations room of Canadian Northwest Atlantic Command in Halifax. The massive wall chart before him showed the devastating reality of submarine warfare. Red pins marking ship losses outnumbered blue pins, representing successful convoy passages by a margin of 3-1. The German submarine force had grown to over 200 operational U-boats, with new vessels entering service every month. Admiral Dönitz had perfected his Wolfpack tactics to such a degree that convoy losses often exceeded 50%. The strategic situation had become so desperate that some Allied planners privately questioned whether the Atlantic lifeline would be maintained. Britain's food reserves had dwindled to just 6 weeks' supply, and fuel shortages threatened to ground the Royal Air Force. Murray's command represented a revolutionary change in naval warfare organization. For the first time in British naval history, a Dominion officer controlled operations in a major theater of war. The Canadian Northwest Atlantic Command was responsible for convoy protection from the North American coast to the mid-Atlantic meeting point with British escorts. This arrangement reflected both Canada's growing naval capabilities and the unique challenges of Atlantic convoy warfare. The Royal Canadian Navy had expanded dramatically since the war's beginning. From a force of 13 destroyers and 5 minesweepers, it had grown to include over 300 vessels of various types. Canadian shipyards were launching corvettes at an unprecedented rate, with new vessels entering service every few weeks. The Flower-class corvettes, originally designed for coastal patrol, had proven remarkably effective in the harsh conditions of the North Atlantic. HMC Saguenay, under the command of Lieutenant Commander David Groulx, had become one of the most successful anti-submarine vessels in the Canadian fleet. The destroyer had been extensively modified with improved radar equipment, additional depth charge throwers, and the latest ASDIC sonar systems. These technological improvements, combined with experienced crews, had begun to shift the balance of underwater warfare. The turning point came during the battle for Convoy SF-42 in September 1941. The convoy, consisting of 65 merchant ships loaded with vital supplies, had been attacked by a Wolfpack of 15 German submarines. The coordinated assault lasted for 3 days and nights, with U-boats striking repeatedly despite the presence of 7 escort vessels. The battle would prove to be one of the most significant actions in the entire Atlantic campaign, according to records from the Directorate of History and Heritage of the Department of National Defense. The engagement demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of German submarine tactics and the growing competence of Canadian escort forces. HMC Saguenay and her sister ship HMC's Moose Jaw had worked together to sink boats using coordinated depth charge attacks, marking the first major submarine kills by Canadian forces. The technological aspects of anti-submarine warfare had evolved significantly by late 1941. The introduction of high-frequency direction-finding equipment, known as HFDUF, allowed escort vessels to pinpoint submarine radio transmissions with remarkable accuracy. When German U-boats reported convoy positions to their headquarters, Allied operators could triangulate their locations and vector escort vessels to attack positions. Radar technology had also begun to impact Atlantic operations. The new centimetric radar systems could detect surfaced submarines at ranges up to 10 miles, even in darkness or poor weather conditions. This technological advantage proved particularly valuable during night actions. When submarines had previously held the initiative, German commanders found themselves increasingly vulnerable to surprise attacks by radar-equipped escorts. The human element of the submarine war had become equally important. Canadian sailors had developed the experience and skills necessary for effective anti-submarine operations. The long months at sea, fighting in some of the world's most challenging conditions, had forged crews capable of operating complex equipment. Under extreme stress, these men understood that their actions directly impacted the survival of their nation and its allies. Captain Murray's strategic vision extended beyond individual convoy battles. He had begun coordinating Canadian naval operations with Allied intelligence services, using decoded German communications to anticipate submarine movements. The breaking of the German Enigma code had provided unprecedented insight into U-boat operations, allowing convoy routes to be adjusted to avoid known submarine concentrations. The winter storms of 1941 had also become an unexpected ally in the fight against submarines. The massive waves and hurricane-force winds that characterized North Atlantic weather made submarine operations extremely hazardous. German U-boats were forced to remain submerged for extended periods, limiting their ability to track and attack convoys. The same storms that challenged Allied merchant ships also neutralized the submarine threat. As 1941 drew to a close, the statistical balance of the Atlantic War had begun to shift slightly in favor of the Allies. Monthly shipping losses had declined from their peak levels, while submarine losses had increased. The combination of improved technology, better tactics, and growing experience had begun to erode the German submarine advantage that had dominated the war's early years. The year 1942 marked a crucial transformation in the Battle of the Atlantic, as Canadian naval forces evolved from desperate defenders to skilled hunters. Commander James Hibberd stood on the bridge of HMC's Oakville, watching his crew prepare for what would become one of the most audacious actions in Canadian naval history. The corvette had been tracking German submarine U-94 for 6 hours, and the moment for decisive action had finally arrived. The strategic situation had shifted dramatically since the previous year. The entry of the United States into the war following Pearl Harbor had brought massive industrial capacity to the Allied cause, but it had also opened new hunting grounds for German submarines. The American coast had become a target-rich environment for U-boats, with merchant ships sailing independently and often without escort protection. German submarine commanders called this period the Second Happy Time, as they achieved devastating success against unprepared American shipping. Admiral Dunitz had responded to American entry into the war by launching Operation Drumbeat, a coordinated submarine offensive against shipping along the eastern seaboard. German U-boats had sunk over 300 vessels in American waters during the first 6 months of 1942. Often within sight of coastal cities, the submarine threat had reached directly into North American waters, making the Battle of the Atlantic a truly continental conflict. Canadian naval forces had been called upon to extend their operations far beyond traditional boundaries. The Royal Canadian Navy was now responsible for convoy protection from the Canadian Maritime Provinces to the Caribbean Sea, a distance of over 3,000 miles. This expansion had required unprecedented coordination between Canadian, American, and British naval commands, as well as the development of new tactical doctrines for extended-range operations. The encounter between HMC's Oakville and U-94 on August 28, 1942, demonstrated the evolution of Canadian anti-submarine capabilities. The German submarine had been attacking a convoy in the Caribbean when Commander Hibberd's corvette detected it using the latest radar equipment. Rather than waiting for the submarine to attack, Hibberd decided to take the initiative and force a surface engagement. The action that followed would enter Canadian naval legend. HMCS Oakville rammed the German submarine at full speed, causing significant damage to both vessels. As the U-boat attempted to escape, Canadian sailors boarded the enemy vessel in hand-to-hand combat, the only such action by Canadian forces during the entire war. The boarding party, led by Petty Officer Arthur Powell, fought German crew members with rifles and bayonets while the damaged submarine wallowed in heavy seas. The technological aspects of anti-submarine warfare had reached new levels of sophistication. By 1942, Canadian corvettes were now equipped with improved ASTIC systems that could maintain contact with submerged submarines, even in rough weather conditions. The addition of Hedgehog mortar, which fired multiple projectiles ahead of the attacking vessel, had increased the probability of successful submarine attacks from 5% to nearly 25%, as documented in the official history of the Royal Canadian Navy. The development of escort carrier groups had provided air cover for Atlantic convoys for the first time. These small aircraft carriers, converted from merchant vessels, could launch fighter aircraft and anti-submarine patrols that extended the protective umbrella around convoys by hundreds of miles. The combination of surface escorts and air cover had begun to close the Atlantic gap where submarines had previously operated with impunity. The human cost of the submarine war had remained staggering throughout 1942. Merchant seamen continued to face mortality rates higher than any other branch of the Allied forces, while naval personnel endured months at sea in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. The psychological pressure of constant vigilance, combined with the physical demands of Atlantic convoy duty, had created a generation of sailors uniquely adapted to the challenges of modern warfare. Canadian shipbuilding had reached unprecedented levels of productivity by the middle of 1942. The nation's shipyards were launching new vessels at a rate that exceeded losses for the first time since the war began. The standardized designs and assembly line production methods, developed during the emergency expansion, had transformed Canada into one of the world's major naval powers. Cities like Halifax, Montreal, and Vancouver had become centers of maritime technology and innovation. The strategic implications of Canadian naval expansion extended far beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. The Royal Canadian Navy had become the fourth largest naval force in the world, with responsibilities spanning from the Arctic Ocean to the Caribbean Sea. This transformation had required not just ships and equipment, but the development of naval traditions, training systems, and command structures that would serve Canada long after the war's end. Intelligence operations had also become crucial to Canadian naval success. The ability to decode German naval communications provided advance warning of submarine movements and allowed convoys to be routed around known danger areas. Canadian naval intelligence officers worked closely with their British and American counterparts to create a comprehensive picture of enemy submarine operations throughout the Atlantic theater. The battle for Convoy ONS-1-100-100-18 in September 1942 demonstrated the effectiveness of improved Canadian escort tactics. The convoy, consisting of 43 merchant ships, was attacked by a wolf pack of 11 German submarines over a period of 4 days. The Canadian escort group, led by HMCs Saguenay, managed to sink 3 U-boats while losing only 2 merchant vessels. This ratio of success represented a dramatic improvement over the devastating losses of the previous year. The spring of 1943 brought what naval historians would later call the killing time in the Battle of the Atlantic. The technological and tactical balance had shifted decisively in favor of the Allied forces, and German submarine losses began to mount at an unsustainable rate. Captain Clarence King, commanding the Canadian Escort Group C-1, stood in the operations room of HMC's Restigouche's radar operators tracked multiple submarine contacts approaching convoy HX-2-100-30-7. The German submarine force had reached its peak strength of over 400 operational U-boats, but the effectiveness of individual submarines had declined dramatically. Admiral Dunitz found himself caught in a strategic dilemma. His submarines were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, while Allied shipping construction had begun to exceed losses for the first time since the war began. The foundation of tonnage warfare was crumbling beneath the weight of improved Allied technology and tactics. The convoy system had evolved into a sophisticated defensive network by 1943. Close escort groups, typically consisting of 6 to 8 warships, provided immediate protection for merchant vessels. Support groups, composed of destroyers and frigates, could be dispatched to reinforce threatened convoys. Long-range aircraft operating from bases in Canada, Britain, and Iceland provided continuous air cover throughout most of the Atlantic crossing. The Atlantic gap where submarines had once operated with impunity had been virtually eliminated. Naval forces had become the backbone of the convoy system. The Royal Canadian Navy was now responsible for protecting nearly 60% of all Atlantic convoy traffic, a responsibility that required over 200 warships and 30,000 personnel. The transformation from a small coastal defense force to a major naval power had been completed in less than 4 years, representing one of the most dramatic military expansions in Canadian history. The technological revolution in anti-submarine warfare had reached its culmination by 1943. The introduction of the 10-centimeter radar system allowed escort vessels to detect surfaced submarines at ranges exceeding 15 miles, even in darkness or heavy weather. High-frequency direction-finding equipment could pinpoint submarine radio transmissions with such accuracy that U-boats were often under attack within minutes of making contact reports to their headquarters. The development of the Squid mortar system had revolutionized underwater attacks. Unlike traditional depth charges, which were dropped behind the attacking vessel, the Squid fired 3 mortar bombs ahead of the escort ship directly to the submarine's calculated position. This forward-firing capability, combined with improved fire control systems, had increased the probability of successful submarine attacks to over 40%, according to analysis from the Naval Historical Branch of the Ministry of Defense. The battle for Convoy ONS-5 in May 1943 represented the turning point of the entire Atlantic campaign. The convoy, consisting of 42 merchant ships, was attacked by a wolf pack of 30 German submarines in what would become the largest convoy battle of the war. The action lasted for 7 days and nights, with continuous submarine attacks against increasingly effective escort defenses. The Canadian escort group B-7, led by Commander Peter Gretton in HMS Duncan, had been reinforced by support groups from the Royal Navy and additional air cover from long-range aircraft. The battle resulted in the sinking of 6 U-boats and the loss of only 12 merchant vessels. More importantly, the psychological impact on German submarine crews was devastating. The hunters had become the hunted, and U-boat morale began to collapse under the weight of mounting losses. The human dimension of the submarine war had undergone a fundamental transformation. German submarine crews, who had once been elite volunteers eager for combat, now faced missions that were essentially suicide operations. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crew had dropped to just 6 months, and experienced commanders were being lost at an alarming rate. The technological advantages that had made submarine warfare so effective were being systematically neutralized by Allied countermeasures. Canadian shipbuilding had reached unprecedented levels of efficiency by 1943. The nation's shipyards were launching new vessels at a rate that exceeded even the most optimistic pre-war projections. The River-class frigates, designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare, were entering service at a rate of 6 per month. These vessels incorporated all the latest technological developments and were crewed by sailors who had learned their trade in the harsh conditions of the North Atlantic. The strategic implications of the changing battle extended beyond the immediate conflict. The Royal Canadian Navy had demonstrated that a relatively small nation could develop world-class naval capabilities when faced with existential threats. The technological innovations developed during the Atlantic campaign would influence naval warfare for decades to come, while the operational experience gained by Canadian naval personnel would serve as the foundation for post-war naval development. Air power had become increasingly important to Atlantic operations by 1943. Long-range aircraft operating from Canadian bases could now provide continuous coverage over convoy routes, forcing submarines to remain submerged for extended periods. The development of improved depth charges and homing torpedoes for aircraft had made air attacks on submarines extremely effective. German U-boats were now vulnerable throughout their operational cycle. From departure to return to base. The intelligence war had also reached new levels of sophistication. The complete breaking of German naval codes allowed Allied commanders to anticipate submarine movements with remarkable accuracy. Convoys could be routed around known submarine concentrations, while escort forces could be positioned to intercept U-boats before they reached attack positions. The combination of signals intelligence and improved tactical capabilities had created a comprehensive anti-submarine system. By June 1943, Admiral Dönitz was forced to acknowledge that the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost. German submarine losses had reached over 30% per month, while convoy losses had dropped to less than 1%. The strategic foundation of the German war effort, the belief that submarine warfare could strangle Britain into submission, had been definitively disproven by the courage and skill of Allied naval forces. The final phase of the Battle of the Atlantic began in the summer of 1943 as Allied naval forces transitioned from defensive convoy protection to aggressive anti-submarine warfare. Commander Deborah Davies of HMC's Hyder led a hunter-killer group composed of 3 Canadian destroyers as they prowled the Bay of Biscay, seeking German submarines attempting to return to their French bases. The strategic initiative had passed completely to the Allies, and the Royal Canadian Navy was determined to press its advantage. Admiral Dönitz had been forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes in May 1943, acknowledging that continued operations would result in the complete destruction of the German submarine force. The decision represented a fundamental strategic defeat for Nazi Germany, as the Atlantic lifeline that sustained Britain and enabled the build-up for the invasion of Europe remained intact. The longest battle of the Second World War had been won by the perseverance and skill of Allied naval forces. The technological superiority of Allied anti-submarine forces had become overwhelming by late 1943. The introduction of the Mark 24 Fido acoustic torpedo allowed aircraft to attack submerged submarines with unprecedented effectiveness. Canadian crewed aircraft operating from bases in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia were sinking German U-boats at a rate that exceeded new construction. The submarine threat that had once seemed invincible had been reduced to a manageable nuisance. The Royal Canadian Navy had emerged from the Battle of the Atlantic as one of the world's most effective anti-submarine forces. Canadian escort groups, we had been responsible for protecting over 25,000 merchant vessel crossings, with a success rate exceeding 99%. The transformation of a small coastal defense force into a major naval power had been achieved through the dedication of Canadian sailors and the industrial capacity of the nation's shipyards. The human cost of the Atlantic campaign had been staggering. Over 30,000 Allied merchant seamen had died in the battle to maintain the lifeline between North America and Britain. The Royal Canadian Navy had lost over 2,000 personnel, while German submarine losses exceeded 28,000. meant the Battle of the Atlantic had claimed more lives than any other continuous military operation of the Second World War. Canadian shipbuilding had reached its peak production by 1940. The nation's shipyards had launched over 350 naval vessels and nearly 400 merchant ships during the war years. The Victory-class cargo vessels, built in Canadian yards using mass production techniques, had played a crucial role in maintaining Allied supply lines. The industrial transformation required to support this production had permanently altered Canada's economic structure. The strategic lessons of the Battle of the Atlantic would influence naval warfare for generations to come. The effectiveness of convoy systems, the importance of air cover, and the decisive role of technology in modern warfare had all been demonstrated during the campaign. The Royal Canadian Navy had proven that small nations could develop world-class military capabilities when faced with existential threats and supported by appropriate industrial resources. As documented in the official history of the Royal Canadian Navy by Gilbert Tucker, the Battle of the Atlantic had fundamentally changed Canada's relationship with the world. The nation had emerged from the conflict as a major naval power with global responsibilities and capabilities. The experience gained during the Atlantic campaign would serve as the foundation for Canada's post-war naval development and its participation in collective security arrangements. The final German submarine offensive in 1945 represented a desperate attempt to influence the war's outcome through technological innovation. The introduction of the Type 21 submarine, with its revolutionary streamlined design and improved underwater performance, briefly threatened to revive the submarine menace. However, the advanced Allied detection systems and overwhelming numerical superiority made these new submarines ineffective against the established convoy system. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 brought the Battle of the Atlantic to its conclusion. The final statistics revealed the magnitude of the struggle. Over 36 million tons of Allied shipping had been sunk, while German submarine losses exceeded 700 vessels. The Royal Canadian Navy had played a decisive role in achieving victory, protecting the lifeline that enabled the defeat of Nazi Germany. The legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic extended far beyond the immediate military victory. The technological innovations developed during the campaign, including advanced radar systems, sonar equipment, and anti-submarine weapons, would influence naval warfare throughout the Cold War period. The operational experience gained by Canadian naval personnel would serve as the foundation for the nation's post-war naval development and its role in NATO maritime operations. The Battle of the Atlantic had demonstrated that the security of democratic nations ultimately depended on their ability to maintain open sea lanes and protect maritime commerce. The Canadian contribution to this victory had been decisive, transforming a small Dominion navy into a major naval force capable of operations on a global scale. The courage and skill of Canadian sailors had helped ensure that the forces of freedom would prevail over the darkness of fascism. The North Atlantic Ocean, which had witnessed 6 years of unprecedented naval warfare, returned to its peaceful role as a highway for international commerce. The merchant ships that had carried the tools of war would now carry the materials needed for reconstruction and recovery. The Battle of the Atlantic was over, but its lessons would endure as a testament to the power of democratic nations when united in a common cause.